When I was a student, I would never have accepted the invitation to speak about the spiritual practice that was important to me, because it always felt to me I was coming up short in any way that I tried. I prayed, but I didn't think I was particularly good at it. I would go to church and would feel fed, but not in the deep spiritual, emotional ways that I noticed that was the case with others. When I tried things like the examen, I enjoyed thinking about the Bible stories about Jesus, but thinking about myself, self-examining myself, always felt like something like navel gazing, and none of those kind of spiritual practices felt right to me. And somehow that seemed to be an expression of me falling short in the spiritual life department. And then one day, that must have been at the end of my time as a PhD student, I stumbled in the library on a book on the relationship between personality types and spirituality. And the author went over the 16 personality types that, according to the Myers-Briggs test, exist, and argued that each type, just as much as each type has its own particular ways of engaging themselves and engaging the people around them and engaging the world, likewise, each type has its own particular way of engaging God. Each type has its own most appropriate way of engaging God, appropriate to the way that that personality is structured, the gifts that that kind of a person has received. And that therefore there is nothing wrong with the fact that some kind of spiritualities and spiritual practices fit somebody more than others. In fact, something that doesn't sit right with you if you try to engage God in a way that you have not been gifted is probably not something you should try to undertake. Well, others may make you flourish more in both the way who you are and the way that you relate to God. Now, according to the Myers-Briggs test, and this will not come as a surprise to anybody who knows me, I am an INTJ. And for an INTJ, the primary way of engaging the world is through thinking, through clear, ordered steps of analysis and arguments. That's their gift. And so the spiritual practice that fits an INTJ most naturally, that is the spiritual practice that may bring an INTJ most close to God, may be thinking. Or as Jesus puts it, loving God with all your mind. Because that's what thinking about God actually is. It's an act of love. It's trying to do right by God, to do right by who God is and what God does, by thinking about it as carefully as you can, by spelling it out, by crafting arguments about it, by analyzing it. If you love somebody, you want to understand that person the best that you can. You want not to create misunderstandings, misconceptions, but you're trying to love that person by understanding that person with all your mind. Now, of course, sometimes people say that God is beyond our understanding and our arguments, beyond the power of our intellect. That God is a mystery and we shouldn't try to unravel that. But I think that's too easy. Sure, God is ultimately beyond the powers of our intellect, but God is likewise beyond the powers of our hearts or beyond the powers of our hands. And just like we wouldn't people to be sloppy in spiritual disciplines of hands and hearts as they love God, just because ultimately their hearts are not big enough to love God rightly, or the works of their hands are not grand enough to do right by God's awesomeness. Likewise, we shouldn't make it easy on ourselves when it comes to thinking about God. So my invitation to you is twofold. First, to be honest with yourselves about who you are and what gifts that you have received. And not to spin your wheels in spiritual practices that simply do not fit how God has made you. And secondly, to see thinking about God is not just something you do in a particular course in seminary, but it is a spiritual practice. To, like Mary, take it all in. All the things that can be said about who God is and what God does. And then to ponder it in your minds and in your hearts.